Hello everybody, it's me, the friendly Englishman again, back with part 2 of our Skaven audiobook review series. This is Seer by C.L Werner. Let's carry on. Then Skarbrit's eyes were changing, glossing over with a greenish luminance as he drew upon the arcane power of the horned rat and the warpstone talisman he clutched in his fist. Cratch could feel tendrils of energy oozing into his brain, trying to smother his thoughts. It took all of his own willpower and sorcerer's knowledge to drive them back, to free his mind of their numbing touch. The adept slumped to the floor, physically drained by the effort of resisting Skarbrit's spell. The slaves were not so fortunate. From the ground, Cratch could see them grow still. Fear withered from their eyes, dispelled by a green glow that was an eerie echo of Skarbrit's own charged glaze. When the Seer gestured, the mob stirred, pulling once again at their chains and the iron staples anchoring them to the walls. This time, however, they did not attack the task as a disordered rabble, but rather as a unified body guided by a single will. That of Skarbrit. One after another, the combined strength of the slaves tore the staples from the wall. The last staple came free just in time for Skarbrit. The sounds of carnage and slaughter had faded from the burrow. In the exposed mouth of the chamber, its mangy pelt smeared in the black blood and yellow fat of the storm vermin, the rat beast snarled and spat. Skarbrit spun around, glaring at the loathsome creature, and pointed a clawed finger at the monster. At his command, the ensorcelled slave surged forward, a chittering mass of claws and fangs. Like a furry tide, they crashed upon the rat beast, crushing it beneath their sheer weight of numbers, bowling it over and slamming it into the crumbling wall of the tunnel. Earth and rock showered down from the ceiling, throwing dust into the musty air. The rat beast fought back, disemboweling slaves with every turn of his massive paws, snapping spines within its iron jaws. For all their numbers, for all the Seer's magic, the stink of fear began to rise from the tangled knot of Skaven sweeping over the monster. Skarbrit gave voice to an inarticulate howl in which was both terror and outraged fury. The sorcerer priest scurried forwards, desperate to reinforce his hypnotic control of the craven slaves. Cratch watched the Seer rush closer to the battle, and his mouth pulled back in a predatory smile. He pulled a small piece of blackish-green rock from beneath his robes, a tiny sliver of refined warpstone. The adept's teeth gnawed at the rock, letting little bits of stony grit burn their way down his throat and through his body. Now it was Cratch's eyes that began to glow with an unholy light, the apprentice's brain that roared with the mighty power of the horned rat. Cratch could feel his whole body pulse with strength, swell with godlike vitality. He felt the essence of the warpstone flow through his entire being, hearing its seductive whisper crawl through his flesh. It was almost worse than Skarbrit's spell, fighting down the euphoric mania of the warpstone, but Cratch knew if he lost control now, his opportunity would be lost. That cold, ugly fact helped him maintain a grip on his reason. He forced his eyes to focus on the rat beast and the slaves, on Skarbrit now standing so very close to the fray. On the crumbling walls and weak ceiling of the tunnel. It seemed so easy. A few words, a few gestures, and the primordial power that raced through his body was reaching out. Like a great hammer, it smashed against the walls. It battered against the ceiling. A deafening roar thundered through the tunnel. In that last instant, Skarbrit turned, locking eyes with his apprentice. Cratch grinned back, baring his fangs in challenge to his hated mentor. Then thousands of tons of earth and rock came crashing down, obliterating Skarbrit's expression of disbelief. Grey Seer, slaves and rat beast all were buried in the collapse. Cratch coughed, spitting dirt from his mouth, choking on the dust that filled the tunnel and stifled the warpstone lanterns. He wiped at his almost blind eyes, even as he was pressing a rag to his snout to act as a filter for his nose. Briefly, Cratch considered waiting to see if the entrance to the burrow had remained intact. Skarbrit was not the only Skaven who could put the wormstone to good purpose. It was the memory of the stone vermin who had been infected by the wormstone's power rather than the dust and dirt that made Cratch decide to flee. He would not brave such a fate as he had seen. He would let others take those risks. Yes, Cratch decided as he scurried through the raw, desolate tunnels. He would need helpers if he wanted to recover the wormstone and reap the rewards of such a find. Cratch's muzzle dripped as he salivated in anticipation of those rewards. He knew where to find his allies. He knew where his report about Skarbrit's discovery would benefit him the most. "Stop your whining or get an honest job," growled Hans Dietrich for what felt like the 100th time since they had set out from the docks. It was a serious threat to make against men like those who lumbered after him through the stinking, dripping corridors. Most of them had been born one kind of thief or another. Compared to their past activities, smuggling was an almost legitimate enterprise, if no less dangerous. There were stiff penalties for bringing contraband into Altdorf. Everyone from the Emperor downwards took a dim view of cheating the excisemen, though nobody really seemed to mind that it was the excisemen who were the biggest thieves. Popular theory on the wharves was that if even half the money the excisemen collected on goods coming into the capital actually were to go where it's supposed to go, Karl Franz would be able to buy back Marienburg. Reviled villains, the excisemen were everywhere on the waterfront, and if they weren't around then, there was always the chance that some wrinkled-faced old charwoman or bleary-eyed stevedore was employed by one. Acting as their eyes and ears, the fish, probably the most notorious of the waterfront gangs, took a special pleasure in floating such toadies in the river. Still, there was always someone desperate enough to take a few coppers from an exciseman, whatever the risks. Which was why men in Hans' profession avoided the wharfs and the streets. There was another, surer way to navigate the swarming, crowded warren that was Altdorf, and do so completely unseen. The sewers of Altdorf were the biggest in the Empire, if not the entire Old World. Built by the dwarves so long ago that some said Sigmar's water was the first to christen them, the sewers existed as an unseen underworld, ignored and forgotten by nearly all who prowled the streets above. Sewer jacks and rat catchers, maybe the odd mutant hiding from the witch hunters, but largely no one bothered the sewers or even thought about doing so. Far from prying eyes and wagging tongues, the sewers were more than a filthy nest of scummy brickwork and walls dripping with slime to Hans. They were his secret road to anywhere in the city. There were dangers, to be sure. Sewer rats grew to the size of small dogs and were infamous for their ferocity and the filthy diseases they carried. There were the grisly water lizards brought back from the Southlands for Emperor Boris Goldgather, which had escaped the imperial menagerie to slink and stalk through the humid damp of the tunnels. Hans himself had seen one of the things once, pale as the belly of a fish and with a tail thick enough to choke an ox. Then there were the floods, when the reservoir beneath Altdorf would overflow and dump its spillage for the sewers to cast the excess into the Reich. There was little warning when these floods would rush through the tunnels. Only by watching the rats could a man find any hint of alarm. If the rats started scrambling for the surface, the smart man would be right behind them. Hans cursed the fiendish cunning of the dwarves. No human would have thought of using the reservoir as a means to clean the tunnels. He cast a nervous look at one of the grimy chutes that yawned in the wall, somewhat reassured to find a big black rat staring back at him from the muck, its whiskers twitching as it gnawed on some nameless filth clutched in its hand-like paws. "Are we there yet?" the thin, reedy voice of Kempf called out from the rear of the little procession. There were 10 men in Hans' little gang, just big enough to keep their cut of the merchandise lucrative, but too small to bounce anyone from the mob, even an annoying weasel like Kemp. "You seen the mark?" Hans snarled back, turned around to glare at Kempf. Like the rest of the smugglers, Kempf was dressed in a grimy set of homespun wool that was only slightly too good to be called rags. Kempf affected a goatskin coat 2 sizes too big for him, the garment hanging well below his knees, while a gaudy scarf circled his throat, hiding an Adam's apple so big the man looked like he swallowed a goblin. Kempf lifted his hands in a placating gesture, causing Hans to roll his eyes. Kempf had an ugly habit of excusing himself from all the heavy work. While the rest of the men laboured under the weight of a half-dozen casks of bootleg Reichland hock from Karabberg, Kempf had conned his comrades into posting him as rear guard to keep a wary eye out for sewer jacks, or worse. "Maybe we passed it," Kempf suggested, visibly cringing when he saw the reaction on Hans's face. The reedy smuggler bobbed his head like a punch-drunk stork and started a bout of his braying, nasal laughter. I know, he said. "You keep a good eye out for the marks. Nobody says you don't. I mean, that's why you're the leader." Kemp's thin face spread in a toothy smile that was both ingratiating and smarmy. "But, I mean, everyone makes mistakes." Hans scowled at the rearguard, sucking his teeth as he imagined burying his fist in that smug smile. He counted to 10, then reversed the numbers. His brother was always on him about his temper. They'd lost a few clients and quite a few men because Hans didn't keep a tight leash on his tongue. More than a few of their enemies had started that way by being on the receiving end of Hans's ire. Someday, Johann was always warning him, someday his temper was going to get all of them into more trouble than they could handle. Hans looked away from Kempf and gave Johann an exasperated look. His brother was younger but taller and more muscular, his features handsome in a rugged sort of way that had all the girls at Argula Cratch's making cow eyes at him and offering discounts. His leather tunic, despite years of abuse and crude mending, still managed to constrain his brawny build. Hair the colour of old corn was cropped close to the skull, starkly contrasting eyes as cold and blue as the upper waters of the Reich. Johann had inherited all the better qualities. Hans was short, his unimposing build fading to fat, his left ear swollen out of proportion thanks to the impact of a Reichsguard bludgeon during the window tax riots many years ago. His nose was crooked, bent into its current asymmetrical fashion by the fist of a dockganger from the hooks. His hair was a scraggly brown mop, like some disordered bird's nest threatening to burst from beneath his battered felt hat. It wasn't just looks that Johann had won out on. The younger brother was smarter, stronger, more cautious, less emotional, and decidedly braver. What Johann lacked, what his older brother provided, was ambition. Starve or steal was a simple choice to make for the people who inhabited the waterfront. The Dietrich brothers had chosen to steal. At first, petty acts of thuggery that yielded petty results. there wasn't much coin to be had roiling drunks as they stumbled after the orc and axe. The real money was to be had by smuggling, sneaking goods from river trader to city merchant without the exciseman interfering. They'd been profiting well from the venture too. Even with his hot temper, Hans had a steady cadre of clients quite willing to put up with him for the sake of avoiding usurious duties and customs. Johann had scouted out a large section of the sewer over the course of several months, making marks in chalk and soot where the walls of the stinking tunnels corresponded with some important landmark above. By watching for the marks, the smugglers always knew where they were and where they had to go. Only Hans hadn't seen any marks for quite some time now. Far too long, now that he thought about it. He didn't like to give any credence to one of Kemp's slippery suggestions, but the sneak might be right this time. Maybe he had missed something. Before he could speak, Hans saw Johann's eyes narrow into a suspicious squint. Slowly, the younger Dietrich began to lower his cask of cheap Carroburg booze. "Something's wrong," Johann said, his voice low. His hand dropped to a weapon belt that was in far better shape than his tunic, fingers tightening above the grip on his dagger. "Who?" But Hans had no need to finish this question. Torches blazed into life from the sewer tunnel up ahead. More lights burst into flame from the cross tunnels to either side. Dark silhouettes moved through the blackness, naked steel reflecting the flickering flames. Hans felt his stomach turn as he decided that the sewer jacks had finally caught them. In the next moment, he found himself wishing they were sewer jacks. "The Dietrich boys," a deep voice growled. A voice Hans and any other scoundrel on the waterfront knew only too well. Gustav Vulg. In a district infamous for casual violence and brutality, Gustav Vulg was a name held in fear. As the speaker stepped out the shadows, Hans reflected that it wasn't size or strength that made Vulg so feared. The man possessed neither in such abundance as to overwhelm the feral courage of rakes and thieves. It was the face, the grizzled scowl with its stubbly hair and heavy brow. Vulg carried an expression that could make a wolf pass water. It burned in his eyes, the pitiless rage looking for any excuse to allow the man to do his absolute worst to his victim and enjoy every screaming minute of it. Vulg oozed out from the darkness, accompanied by a bull-necked bruiser carrying a torch. Other thugs followed close behind. Vulg looked the smugglers up and down, his lip curled in scorn. "Quite an accomplishment," he snarled. "Your operation has become big enough to become annoying to Herr Klast. Bad news for you." To add emphasis to his statement, Vulg slapped the hilt of his sword. For the moment, it was sheathed. Nobody was fool enough to think the moment would last. Klast, Vesper Klast. He was even more of a boogeyman to the inhabitants of the waterfront than Vulg. A big-scale racketeer and gang leader, it was Klast-controlled criminal bands all across Altdorf, from Little Tilia to the Morwies. After the fish and the hooks had been at least partially broken up by the Altdorf Dockwatch, in the weeks after the murderous beast had finally been brought to ground, it was Vesper Klast who had become the undisputed power on the waterfront. And Gustav Vulg was his enforcer, extorting a percentage from every transaction, criminal or legal, that happened in his territory, brutally coercing many of the district's thieves to join Klast's family. Hans had resisted Vulg's suggestion that his band of smugglers accept the protection of his gang. That meeting had ended when one of Hans' fingers bent so far backward it wasn't so much broken as snapped. It had also ended with Johann's dagger tickling a piece of anatomy Vulg wasn't too keen on losing. The last view the brothers had of Vulg was him screaming for a chirurgeon and clutching his blood-soaked breeches. That had been 3 months ago. They'd been lucky to avoid him so long. Now Renard had decided their luck was at an end. "I want the wine," Vulg stated, his tone broaching no argument. "Then you're going to show me where you're taking it. I'll make a good example of someone who thinks they can still use independence without Herr Klust finding out." "How do we know you won't just kill us anyway?" Hans challenged. Vulg's smile was as ugly as an orc in a nursery. "You can die here, slow, or you can die there. I'll have other things to do there, so I'll make it quick." Johann pulled his dagger from its sheath. "How about I just gut you like the pig you are and leave you floating here with the rest of the..." Hans stared in horror as his brother lunged at Vulg. The entire sewer exploded into madness, armed men charging from the darkness to confront the smugglers. Hans dodged the murderous sweep of a boat hook, driving his elbow into the thug's belly and knocking the wind out of him. So much for Johann being the level-headed one, Hans thought as he drew his own dagger and joined the fray in earnest. 6 casts of Reichland Hock, 3 dead and 2 men missing. Johann knew he should be thankful that any of them were still alive, but he still couldn't help but grumble over their losses. They'd accounted for at least 2 of Vulg's gang, but unfortunately he wasn't one of the casualties. Not bad considering they'd been outnumbered 3-1, still. If Vulg's men had known the sewers half as well as the smugglers, there was no chance they'd have given the thugs the slip. Then again, giving them the slip had also put Johann in a situation he hadn't encountered in quite some time. He had no idea where they were. It was more than Vulg's men removing marks from the walls. Johann would swear on the hammer of Sigmar he'd never seen this stretch of tunnel before. He tried to keep his confusion to himself, not wanting to panic the men. He felt that his brother had some inkling as to what was wrong, but trusted him to keep quiet. When they came upon the breach in the sewer wall, however, even the dullest of the surviving smugglers knew something was wrong. The jagged tear in the brickwork, like the yawning mouth of some immense snake, was certainly something they would remember. Johann edged forwards, peering through the opening. He risked lighting a candle. Beyond the breach was a tunnel, raw earthen walls that looked to have been carved out with bare hands rather than tools. There was a foul smell as well, a thick animal stench that even the reek of the sewers couldn't overwhelm. Hans appeared at his side, staring into the earthen tunnel. He glanced back, watching the fear grow in this small band of thieves. "We can hide from Vulg's gang in here," Hans proclaimed boldly, gambling that their fear of the unknown wasn't quite so robust as their fear of Gustav Vulg. The gamble played out, and soon the entire band of smugglers was creeping through the narrow, winding tunnel. The unsettling sound of earth shifting overhead and the occasional stream of dust falling from the ceiling did nothing to improve their spirits. But it was when the huge Emil Kleiner, a former stevedore before he decided that even so marginally legitimate a profession wasn't to his taste, found the body that things really took a turn for the worse. His ear-battering shriek was such that if any of Vulg's gang was still following the smugglers, they could not fail to find their quarry now. A snarled reprimand died on Johann's lips as he stared down at the ugly, mangled thing that had so terrified Kleiner. The noxious carcass was almost man-sized, dressed in a crude grey robe even the most pathetic of Altdor's beggars would have refused to be seen in. It was covered in bloodied fur, and its appearance, for all its mutilation, was that of a giant rat. A rat that seemed to have thought it was a man. Frightened whispers came from the circle of smugglers gazing down on the thing. Half-remembered childhood tales of the verminous underfolk and their kidnapping ways rose to the forefront of each man's mind. Several made the signs of Renald and Sigmar, praying to their gods for deliverance from such mythic nightmares. Even Johann felt the nervous urge to glance down the tunnel to discover if the dead thing had any of its living fellows about. Hans bullied his way through the frightened men, sneering with contempt at both their fear and the unnatural corpse that sprawled at their feet. "Gondred's noose," he swore. "What is wrong with you slack-jawed curs? Never seen a dead mutant before?" Hans punctuated his outburst with a strong kick to the dead thing's horned skull. The corpse rolled obscenely from the impact. The leader's outburst rallied the men, and nervous laughter echoed in the crumbling tunnel. Hans was right, of course, the smugglers decided. The thing was no more than a mutant wretch, looking like it did. There was small wonder the scum had chosen to hide itself down in the sewers. The only thing remarkable about it was that it had avoided the witch hunters so long. The smugglers began following the tunnel once more. The air was dank and foul, leading Johann to believe it didn't lead anywhere, but Hans was more obstinate. They passed carefully around several places that showed signs of recent collapse. Once a great pool of black blood rewarded their investigation, seeming to seep from beneath a recent cave-in. The men carefully avoided the ominous sign and pressed on. Not far from the cave-in, the smugglers found a large chamber. If anything, the air was even fouler here. The floor of the cavern was littered with bones and fresh offal. Putrid blood splashed everywhere, and gobbets of gnawed meat splattered against the walls. A quick inspection told Johann that whatever this place had been, the other tunnels that opened into it had collapsed a long time ago. He tried not to look too closely at the strange bones and furry meat littering the floor. "Look at that!" The words left Hans' mouth in an awed whisper. The smuggler was staring in open wonder at a huge chunk of greenish stone resting at the center of the room, glowing faintly with its own inner light. Johann felt his skin crawl just looking at it. He could tell most of the other men felt the same way. "Black magic," hissed old Mueller, the eye that hadn't been pulled from its socket by an over-eager raver pirate, squinting with a mixture of suspicion and loathing. At his words, other smugglers began making the signs of their gods for protection. "Maybe," agreed Kempf. "But have you ever heard of any kind of magic that wasn't worth a fair number of crowns?" The little thief scrambled forwards and joined Hans beside the weird rock. He grinned as he studied the thing, reaching out a hand and scratching at the rock. Kempf sniffed at his finger and his eyes widened. "Weird stone," Kempf declared. The eyes of every man present grew wide, not from fear, but from greed. Weird stone was a valuable commodity, so valuable that even the lowest cutpurse knew its worth. A type of rock soaked in magic that, it was said, could do everything from curing shingles to turning lead into gold. It was said to be able to remove wrinkles from the old and build strength in the young. Pigments mixed with wyrdstone dust could allow even the most talentless artist to create a priceless masterpiece, and a single whiff of wyrdstone poultice was certain protection from the evils of mutation and madness. Those who lusted after wyrdstone insisted it was a different substance from the abhorred warpstone, the raw stuff of chaos that brought madness and mutation with its touch. Such connections were the delusions of ignorant, superstitious fools in their minds. There was almost nothing alchemists and wizards wouldn't do to possess even a small measure of wyrdstone. What they were looking at was anything but a small measure. Still, the avarice of the men was tempered by the grim knowledge that few substances in the Empire were as forbidden as wyrdstone. If there was nothing wizards wouldn't do to get some, there was nothing the witch hunters wouldn't do to anyone they caught with it. Even for men who risked daily hangings or stays in Munzen Keep, The thought of what the witch hunters did to heretics was sobering. Hans stared at the glowing rock for several minutes, then nodded his head slowly. "Kempf, do you think you could find us a buyer for that thing?" "One. Why not a dozen?" Kempf replied enthusiastically. The answer decided Hans. "Kleiner, Muller, fetch that thing down. We'll take it back to the hideout." The men hesitated, but a sharp look from their leader had the pair lumbering up to the pile of bones and pulling down the heavy rock. They drew frayed rags from their pockets, wrapping them tightly about their faces to fend off any sorcerous fumes, wound ribbons of torn cloth about their hands to defend their skin from the touch of magic. Johann felt a shiver pass through him as he saw the green light stretch and grip the arms of the men, casting a diseased pallor across their skin. The men carrying the rock didn't seem to notice, and Hans was already conferring with Kempf in a soft whisper, trying to figure out how they would best bring their strange discovery to market. As they worked their way back down the crumbling tunnel, Johann could not share the optimism of his brother. He could not shake the impression that far from making their fortune, their troubles had only just begun. Okay guys, I will interrupt there and say that's the end of part 2. I hope you enjoyed that. I feel kind of sad for Hans. It'd be great to hear from you in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that, and I look forward to speaking to you all again very soon. Goodbye.